All right. Good morning, everybody. It is good to see you here today. We're having a bit of a slow start today. Sometimes that happens. I looked down at my laptop and I was like, 9:29. Rush, rush, rush. And here I am. It's only like 3 minutes later. So that's not bad. All right. So we're going to get ready to get rolling here. And we are on Where Can We Hear God's Voice? Part three, which may or may not actually be part three, depending on how you count things. But we're looking at the non-writing prophets. We started talking about the non-writing prophets last week. They are distinguished from the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and the major prophets and the minor prophets. And when we say major and minor or non-writing, none of them has anything to do with importance of the prophet. It's just a function of the major prophets exclusively were their prophecies were so long or their books were so long that they were basically one scroll each. And then the minor prophets, for the most part, are much shorter books, and all of their works were contained on one scroll. And then the the non-writing prophets are prophets that we meet, if you will, during the historic books in the Old Testament. So um, non-writing prophets are people like Samuel's a non-writing prophet. We meet him in First Samuel. Second Samuel, you meet somebody like Nathan, and you meet others. You get into First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, and you start meeting Elijah and Elisha and a number of other prophets as well. Some of them named, some of them unnamed. And we talked about as well last week that there was a cultural shift among the kind of the suzerain kings. Remember the we might call them emperors, but now when we think of the ancient Near East, we call them suzerain kings. They were kings that had a lot of authority over vassal kings, kings that might be kings of a city or a smaller territory. And in the somewhere around 800 BC or so, suzerain kings made a shift. Prior to 800 BC, approximately, suzerain kings would exclusively send emissaries to somewhat rebellious or disruptive vassal kings. They would send the emissary directly to that king, and he would go to that king's court and he would speak directly to the king. After approximately 800 BC, suzerain or vassal kings would not only send their emissaries to the king, but they would also send their emissaries to the town square or the city square or the city gate, and they would proclaim to the public what their king was doing wrong and what the results of their king's disobedience would be. And so the role there of that emissary changed, and what God did was, as the culture shifted in its expectation, as it were, of communication from one king to another, God used that shift as well. And so that's why after about 800, we start seeing the writing prophets, people like Isaiah that went directly to the kings and spoke directly to the kings, but then also went and spoke to the people in large groups, or had some what seemed to us to be some pretty outlandish, I'll call it theater, that God directed them to do. It seems outlandish, seems really wild, and we'll look at some of those things as time goes on. They're more frequent among the writing prophets than they are among the non-writing prophets. But we'll check that out as well once we get into the writing prophets. So let's take a moment and pray together, and then we'll dive into today's lesson. Father, thank you very much for today. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for your graciousness. Thank you for how good you are. Lord, I pray that you would keep your hands upon us today as we spend time in your word. Lord, that we would remember that you are not a God who is dead. You are not a God who is far off. You are not a God who does not speak to his people. But Lord, you are alive. You are immanent, and you are everywhere. And Lord, you love your people, and therefore you speak. Bless us today as we learn about you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we are about just over halfway down the first side of the page. We're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 through chapter 17, verse 7. So join me, please. All right. In the 38th year of Asa, this is picking up 1 Kings 16:29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. Now, Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. All right, so give me a little background. Tell me a little bit about Ahab. What does the text tell us about Ahab? He is an evil man. He is an evil, evil man. How far does he depart from proper worship of God? Pretty much as far as you can go, right? Remember, I mean, Jeroboam, who was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, he realized after his rebellion and that God separated the nations, he realized, hey, if the only place we can go worship God, Yahweh, is down at the temple in Jerusalem, then I'm going to have some problems because Jerusalem's in Judah, and my people are going to keep on traveling down every year down to Jerusalem in Judah, and that's going to be all kinds of revenue for my enemy king down there, Rehoboam. I don't want that to happen. So I have a brilliant idea, says Jeroboam. I am going to make two calves, two bulls, two cows, whatever, and I am going to put one at each end of the nation. And then he said, "Here are your gods that led you out of Egypt." Right? He made idols, and then he names them Yahweh. And then he institutes a new priesthood that you could pay into. He dissolves the Levites in the northern kingdom. You can't work at these shrines unless you, or temples, whatever, with these idols, unless you pay up, and high places and all that. And the Bible here says, as if walking in the ways of Jeroboam was a light thing. So against Ahab, Jeroboam looks pretty good, because even though he instituted wrong worship of Yahweh, and he allowed for high places and idolatry, at least, and I say this carefully, at least he still called it Yahweh. He was wrong, 100% wrong, very evil, wrong thing to do, 100%. But then Ahab comes along, and what does Ahab do? He does worse by doing what? Yeah, he he marries Jezebel, right? Who's daughter of the king of the Sidonians, which is to the north, the nation to the north, and uh, city, powerful port city. And then he worships Baal, right, who was one of the gods of the Canaanites. Baal is a fertility god. He's often perceived as a bull. He's also, I believe, he has some degree of authority with like thunder and rain and things like that. And maybe he's like a storm. I think that's more of it. He's more of a storm god, and thunder, rain, whatnot. Also therefore a war deity. Super considered like strong, so that's why the image of a bull gets used with him. Because a bull is a strong animal, and so Ahab sets up a temple for Baal in his capital, where he goes and worships. And then what else does he do? Builds an Asherah. So what's an Asherah? Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes it'll just say Asherah. Sometimes it'll say Asherah pole. Asherah is Baal's consort. So she's not his wife, godly wife, but she's sort of this partner, yeah, for convenience. And there's a pole that you can figure that out, and it gets put up, and you worship her and Baal around this pole. And if it's Asherah is a fertility goddess, right? So you've got the god of the rain and the storms, and this fertility goddess, and then there'd actually be sexual rites that would be practiced as part of worship. And forget about Yahweh. Just forget about him. Ahab barely even gives lip service to Yahweh. So what does God do in response? Sort of no more rain. What does he do first? He sends Elijah, right? Because these are the non-writing prophets. King, you're doing the wrong thing, so I'm going to send my emissary to speak to you, right? Just like a suzerain king would. And the suzerain king would come to the vassal king and say, "You're not doing things the right way. And I've been sent from the big guy, and I'm going to tell you, if you keep doing things the wrong way, this is what's going to happen." The amazing thing is the New Testament tells us that Elijah says there won't be rain. It's almost as if it's Elijah's idea. Almost. God says through Elijah, or maybe God blesses what Elijah says. You go, and there's no other information. But the text tells us that Elijah doesn't say, "This is the word of the Lord. There will be no rain." He just says there will be no rain or no dew. Why no rain or no dew? What's that? Nothing lives without rain, right? And Baal is Asherah is the fertility god. Baal's the storm god, right? So remember back when we were looking at Moses and we're talking about Moses dealing with the Egyptians, Moses go God go no, I mean God dealing with the Egyptians. Sorry. We're talking about God dealing with the Egyptians. God goes right in, and the first thing he does is he undercuts the power of all of their deities. Every single one of them. Or at least, I guess not every single one because they had so many, but every single one of his plagues is a direct assault with absolute victory over one of their deities. So God motivates Elijah, or Elijah knows what to do, or however it works, that, okay, so fine. I'm just going to let you know that God is sovereign. God has power over your dumb Baal and his stupid girlfriend Asherah. And let me tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be nothing growing in the land. Goodbye, power of Asherah. And by the way, here's how it's going to happen. There will be no rain. There won't even be dew. And if you think about it, rain and dew are associated in the sense that when you walk outside and you've had a heavy dew, that especially when you have a big difference between the temperature in the day and the temperature in the night, that's when you're going to get kind of a heavy dew. You come out and the grass is all wet, and maybe when you're a little child, you might walk out and think, oh, it rained in the night, but it didn't rain. But really, dew has nothing to do with rain. It just has to do with a separation, big distance between the temperatures day and night. That gives you that. That gives you the dew. Janice. That that does appear. A lot of folks and do say they. Yes, it's a tricky conversation. But yes, it does appear that prior to the flood, the dew watered the earth, and it was sufficient. And man, when you get enough dew, and actually in the Middle East, dew is what they often rely upon to water their plants. If you have no irrigation nearby, you're relying upon the dew to water your plants. But it's as if God is saying through Elijah, I am so going to undercut the power of Baal that you won't even get a hint of his power, of this guy that you fools are worshiping right now. You won't even get a hint because there won't even be dew, which is meteorologically impossible. If you were to say to a meteorologist, what would it take for there to be no dew? The meteorologist would say, well, it just wouldn't happen. I mean, it might dry off when the sun comes up, but there's going to be some sense of dew between night and day, especially in a place like a desert where you have high temperatures during the day and then colder temperatures, much colder temperatures at night. You get a 40, 50 degree shift in temperature. You're going to have dew. Not at God's word. God has power over meteorology. God has power over science. If God wants to suspend the rules, God can suspend the rules, and he can keep the earth spinning and keep everybody alive at the same time, because God has that power. And what are some key phrases? Are there any key phrases? Yeah, so we got his message. What are some key phrases in this passage? Anything that jumps out at you? In the whole thing. That's pretty huge, right? Um, Interesting that it doesn't say any of the kings. Why do you think it's significant that we have a text that says Ahab did more to anger him than all of the kings before him, as opposed to any of the kings before him. Go ahead, Janice. What are you thinking? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. It is not necessarily so, right? Because sometimes the words any and all, they can have this sense of overlap. But generally speaking, when I say any, I mean individually. And when I say all, I mean all combined. Right? If somebody so we're having this caroling tonight. We're going to go caroling, and when we come back, I'm sad to say, Debbie's made some cookies. And there's they're gonna be peanut butter no bake, and there's cinnamon Rice Krispie treats, and then there are some kind of Christmas sugar cookies. I'm going to tell you two things. I can eat any of those cookies, and I can eat all of those cookies. Right? I could have one. I could pick one. Or I could pick them all, as in bring all of these cookies to my house because I'm going to eat them all, right? They're all going to be really good, right? I can eat all of those cookies. And I could say all, and I could mean, I could eat all of these. And mean, I can have one of each. Or I could have, all of these look good to me. But I can also mean, I could be an absolute piggly wiggly and eat every single one of these cookies. And I tend to think that when God is speaking about the evil of Ahab, he's not saying he's worse than each of these. I tend to think he's saying that Ahab is worse than the sum of these kings. If you add up all their evil, Ahab's worse. Yes, Ella. Does it twice? And verse 3, and Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. You use an NIV? NIV can be a little sloppy with translation. And it's very, very readable translation. Very, very readable translation. But it can be a little sloppy sometimes. That's why I've started using the ESV. It's a little bit more stilted in reading, little, but not significantly. But it's much better at the kind of word for word and picking stuff out. Gotcha. Yep. Who were before him, and then where else does it say that? Yep. And then all. Gotcha. Made more than all the kings who were before him. Yeah. So it says right. I see what you're saying. Mm-hmm. All in all, both places. All in all, both places. Yeah. What's the Hebrew word? Mm-hmm. In some cases in ancient languages, the word means both, and then you have to make a decision about what the text is saying, whether you use any or all. It's really bad. Either way, really bad. Really, really bad. Either he's the number one bad king, or he's like the number one baddest, the most worst of them all. So we got that number one. So we know that he is an evil king, and that is a key thing for us to pick out. I think, again, I don't think you can harp enough on statements like, and as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And then it goes on to list a number of things that he did that were just over the top evil, well beyond. So that's verses 31 and following. It's like kaboom, 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 kaboom. He did all of these things. And then we learn about Hail down in Jericho. Um, and how about in the text passage there, 17, 1 through 7? Anything there that jumps out at you? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Sometimes, and so if there's not a lot of information about how God spoke, then the easiest thing to do is to go with the easiest to interpret. Right. So if it says the word of the Lord came to him, then the easiest thing to interpret, right? You don't go with the most wild interpretation. You go with the easiest interpretation. And so the easiest interpretation is, if you were to say the word of Bill came to me, it would be a weird way to say Bill said, right? And generally speaking, when Bill says something to you, you hear it, right? Generally speaking, when Bill I do have sometimes a frequency I speak at that sometimes people around me can't hear, but usually and that either means I thought I told them or they forgot. But and we're not sure which one that is. But so I would say he heard it, or like we've talked about as well, either he physically heard it, or for all intents and purposes, he believed he physically heard it, right? That God spoke directly to his mind, and it would be for him as if he'd heard the voice of God, but God went, around his ears and went directly. And it doesn't really matter either way if God spoke and Elijah audibly heard it, or God spoke and, with the exception of the sound waves rattling his eardrum, he heard the word of the Lord and it went directly to his brain. And God gives him some pretty cool directions, right? I'm going to send you to a brook that's going to keep on flowing. And he sends him over to this Kidron, right? Or Cherith? Cherith. Sends him to Cherith. And then he says, and the ravens are going to bring you food. Isn't that something? Why ravens? They're big and they can carry things. They're smart. Also, ravens are prone to picking stuff up that's not theirs and carrying it around, taking it. They take prizes. One time when I was working at Sandy's aunt's house, I was doing Aunt Beth's house. I was doing a lot of gardening, and I was dirty and sweaty. And if you've ever seen me sweat, it's appalling. It is just a lot of water. And so I took my glasses off because I was so sweaty, and I set them down because I was just dripping sweat into my glasses, and I couldn't see, and I could see better without them than I could with them on. And when I came back to get my glasses, they were gone. But all day long, I'd been hearing the ravens in the trees. And I'd read that, because I used to do bird watching, ravens will pick up shiny objects and adorn their nests with them. So somewhere in Newburyport, Massachusetts, in or about 1997, was a pair of glasses sitting up in a nest that some male raven had brought to his mate to say, "Look at the pretty thing I got you for our house." And there it is, up in the top of a tree somewhere. So Genesis. So God uses the ravens according to their nature to travel long distances to bring him food. It's pretty cool. Against their nature to bring it not to their nest and go to bring it to Elijah. Yep. Yep. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Mm. Yep. 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 Not so dissimilar from when I heard God's voice when I was driving, and I got hit by the Mack truck. That it was to save. This is to save Elijah's life, and we're getting information about that, and we're going to see more of that as we read on. Any more? Anything else you want to pull out? Yes. I think I heard from the Lord that I should do this, but I don't know. It seems kind of strange. Do it because it might be to save your life. Yep. And again, I want to go back to the first verse. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord of God, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years." Most of the time, when a prophet speaks, the prophet says, "Thus says the Lord." Continues. This is a very, very interesting instance where that is not the backdrop to what the condition is going to be. That's very interesting, and I think it's noteworthy, um, and and also the phrase "before whom I stand" is a very important phrase as well. What does that mean? Before whom I stand. He's representing God. Exactly. I am here representing God. So the cool thing about God, right, is if I'm representing a suzerain king, let's say I'm traveling from Nineveh, the one-time capital of Assyria, and I'm going down to Samaria to go berate the king that's in Samaria because he's not been doing his thing. I'm coming from the court of the king of Nineveh, traveling on foot or maybe on the back of a camel or some such thing for several hundred miles and coming down to Samaria. I would say, according to King, whatever practically impronounceable name he would have, I'm here to tell you, right? But that emissary is not standing before that king any longer. But Elijah knows that no matter where he goes, he stands before the Lord. The Lord's presence is there. And that's an important reminder for Elijah because he forgets that from time to time, just like you and I do. All right, so let's journey on here in verses 8 through 16. The word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink." And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward, make something for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel: the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said. And she and her household ate for many days, and the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord he spoke by Elijah. All right. So um, now, how did God direct Elijah, and what is yeah? Let's start with that. How did God direct Elijah? Go meet the woman. Go to Zarephath. Where's Zarephath? In Sidon. Why is that significant? The home of Jezebel, right? So God is directing Elijah to go to the queen's father's land, his evil king's father-in-law's land, territory. What does that mean? If it's in Sidon, it's not in. If it's in Fairfield, it's not in St. Albans. If it's in Sidon, it's not in Israel, right? The people of the ancient world, we want to remember this. This is super important. The people of the ancient world believed that gods ruled nations. They believed gods ruled nations. So if God calls Elijah to go from just beyond the Jordan, the east side of the Jordan, and I'm not exactly sure what Cherith is. It may be in the land where the um, some of the Israelites settled before they came into the Promised Land. Is that he calls him from out of the Promised Land into a land that is not the Promised Land. The people of the ancient world, quite probably even Elijah, even if he knew it wasn't true, it might have put a little hitch in his step. And it's not a short walk, right? Hmm. Right. God, can't you send me somewhere closer? There must be another just over this hill. There's got to be another brook, right? Can't you send me there? Nope. You're going up to Sidon, right? Yeah, but God, that's outside of the promised land. That doesn't make sense. No, you're going to Sidon. Don't worry. I'm God of the whole world. I've got this. Goes up to Sidon to do what? Zarephath. Who's he going to meet? Yeah, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. But God, if she lives in Sidon, she doesn't listen to your commands, right? Because if she lives in Sidon, she doesn't worship Yahweh, right? She worships somebody else, Baal, whomever. But God has commanded her. What does it mean if God has commanded her and she doesn't worship God? And apparently she's going to do it anyway. Shows God's power. How? Yeah, right? If if Serge is at work this week and Brock's boss walks into Serge's work and says, "You, I need you to go and get in one of my propane trucks and go make a delivery." What are you going to say, Serge? Really? What do you? He just wants to drive a big truck. And in reality, okay, and you, in reality, Brock's boss has no authority over you, right? He has no, and you're going, I don't work for you, right? I don't work for you. But here's this woman that probably worships Baal or Asherah or whomever, certainly does not worship Yahweh, living up in Sidon. God says, you're going to take care of Elijah. and she does it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As the Lord your God, and so that statement, "as the Lord your God lives," in verse 12, um, may not be a recognition of God's authority, but it is a recognition of who Elijah is. So a worshiper of Baal would not deny that Yahweh was a God, because the people of the ancient world, they were syncretistic and they were highly polytheistic. So polytheism means that you worship many gods. To be syncretistic means that you can adopt the worship of another god or another religion into your own religion without it being a conflict of interest for you. Voodoo does this. Voodoo has aspects of spiritualism, of African religion, and also a heavy dose of Catholicism in it. And for a person who practices voodoo, that's not a problem. For a Roman Catholic, it would be a huge problem, right? For a Protestant Christian like us, it's a huge problem. But for them, it's nothing. They pick up Caribbean gods, add it to it. They pick up Roman Catholic teaching, add it to it. African spiritualism, add it to it, not a problem. People of the ancient world were like that. They would have recognized that Yahweh was a God, but not such a great God, since your people are weak and you guys, you're worshiping our gods down there, and you're losing to us in battles, and they'd have all these reasons why they wouldn't say. However, God had commanded the people of Israel to look a certain way. They were to dress a certain way. They were to cut their hair a certain way. They were to not trim their beards. And so when Elijah comes walking along, a person who lives in Sidon that has regular trade with Israel or with Judah, they'd look and they would just as easily be able to spot him as a Jew as we can spot a person who's from Canada because they have Quebec plates on their car, just like that. It would be easy for them because of the way he dressed, the way that he looked. So she looks at him and says, "Just as your God lives, I'll tell you something. I'm going to speak to you according to what you respect, according to what you understand." It doesn't mean that she worships God or that she even realizes that she's obeying God. But what I want us to think about is something we don't like to think about, because we're members of the United States. We're citizens of the United States. We vote. We vote for what we want. We vote for what we like. If I want to go out and go get fast food, I can pick in St. Albans between Burger King and McDonald's. I strongly recommend against this location. But we can pick whatever we want. We can go and we can do that. We like our choice. We like our freedom. We often ask, what about free will? God has the authority to subvert our free will, to take it over whenever he wants. And God's taken this woman, and I'm not saying he's playing her like a puppet, but she has been commanded to take care of Elijah. And she's going to do it. And we're going to see the mechanics of the how. They're going to happen. So what? So why is he, or why was he directed? Why do you think maybe that Elijah gets directed to Zarephath? Absolutely. And you know what, Joy? God is absolutely interested in the people of the Sidonians seeing that God's power crosses borders? Because God's love for the people of this earth is not limited to the people of Israel, right? He created Israel. He called Israel to himself in order to be a light to the nations around them, and they weren't. We've been watching the Santa Clauses. Anybody been watching the Santa Clauses? It's a lot of fun. Good stuff. I'm enjoying it. And there's this magic globe in the Santa Clauses. And there's a dark spot in the middle of it that's tracking like Christmas spirit in the world. Well, the globe is tracking Christmas spirit, and the bigger the dark blob in the middle of it gets, the worse the Christmas spirit in the world gets, and the more it's starting to, that Christmas spirit is going away, and people are starting to believe in Christmas less. And I think that God wanted Israel to be a light, but instead, Israel became the dark blob in the middle of the ball. And so God stepped in. And periodically, over time, God brings the light. And I think that translates for us today as well. I think a lot of times the church has been the dark blob. By our actions, what we've done, what we've allowed for, what our leaders have done, or what people who are perceived by the world around us to be our leaders, they've created a dark spot in the blob, or in the ball, the globe. But it's our job to be the light. But even in those places, those times when faith or regard for who God is or for what the church is has failed in our culture, we've seen other times where God steps in and God does something awesome to draw people's attention. And I hope and pray that we're going to be seeing a time like that very soon, but I think that that's something that happens in Zarephath, right? Because what happens? The woman comes out, she's collecting sticks, and Elijah asks for what? Water. Why does Elijah ask for water? He's thirsty, right? There's been neither dew nor rain. He's wanting some water. And so he says to her, hey, can you bring me some water? Why does God send Elijah to a widow? Why does she need to be taken care of? She doesn't have a husband. And in the ancient world, women had very few rights. A woman without a husband was considered cursed. And a widow with children was just miserably, miserably, miserably poor. They would be the first people to die in a drought, a siege, any period of stress, turmoil. They're the first ones to go. And likely their children would be orphaned and become street urchins, and then they would go. That's the way it is. But why does God send Elijah to the lowest of the low? It's the same reason that the Messiah came through Mary and Joseph. If God had sent the Messiah to be born in King Herod's household, way up here, it would be easy for us to say, I'm not a king. I'm not royalty. I'm not a great person. I'm not powerful. God didn't send his son for me. But because God sent his son through a couple of Galilean peasants, we suddenly see that the standard to be somebody to follow Christ or that God sent his love to is very, very low. Anybody. God sends Elijah to This woman that is on the verge of death. She's so poor, she can't get food. She and her son are going to take the littlest bit of dough that they can make, and they're going to have their last little bit of bread together. And then they're planning to starve to death. That's what mom is thinking. This is what's going to happen. We're going to have our last meal, and then my son and I are going to starve to death. God sends Elijah to her because God's standard of who can step into the kingdom is very low. You have to be able to breathe. Once you can breathe, you've met the standard. All you have to do after that is obey, is follow, is have faith in. And we learn in the New Testament faith in his son, but that faith, that death of Christ works backwards into the Old Testament. God sends Elijah to this widow because he's sending a message to Sidon that says, anyone can follow me. Anyone. And in that sense, think about what I talked about emissaries getting sent to kings. God's already working contrary to society, to culture, their cultural expectation. He'll work within it, and he'll work contrary to it at the same time, because God is beyond our culture. So let's look at verses. And so let's not, right? So that he says to her, do not fear and go. After he asks her for some bread, and she's like, we're going to die. We don't have enough for the two of us. Don't fear. Go and do as you said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward make something for yourself and your son. You make me a little cake. A little bit. Don't make me a lot. You make me a little bit. You step out in obedience. You step out in faith. You step out and follow with this little bit. Then go back and do what you want and watch what God will do. You're not going to run out of flour. You're not going to run out of oil. You go ahead. You go make the little cake. Measure it out. Measure what you already have left. After you bring me the little cake, that same amount of flour prior to the little cake coming out is going to be in there. That's what Elijah's saying to her. So she obeys. She does it. And what do you know? Through this whole period of time that Elijah stays at her house, these weeks, she always has the same amount of flour and oil to make the cakes. But wait, there's more. Let's jump down to verses 8 through 17 to the end of the chapter. Right? Oh, no, I didn't include that. I'm going to include it because it's too good. Check this out. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." Isn't that what we do? God starts working in our life, and then something bad happens, and we turn around on God and we blame it on God. We blame it on him. And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up to the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, have you brought calamity upon even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." Listen. And the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." Why did God send Elijah to the widow in Zarephath? So he could be glorified. Because I can tell you something. This widow no longer saw Yahweh as one among many, right? No longer. And isn't it cool in this passage? God apparently doesn't say to Elijah, take the boy from her arms and go to the upper chamber where you are, which that upper chamber is not really a chamber. The people of the ancient world, it was hot. It's hot in the Middle East. And in the evening time, there's often a breeze that comes off the Mediterranean and cools the place down. And so they would have the top of their house, there would be a sitting area that would often, if they could afford it, would have some kind of shelter so they could sit out of the sun, but still feel the cool wind, the cool breeze. It's kind of like an ancient version of a screen house, right? Or an awning, something like that. That's where Elijah's living up there, because it would be inappropriate for him to live downstairs in the one-room house with a woman that wasn't his wife. So he's living upstairs. He's sleeping upstairs in this screen house. And he doesn't hear from God, take the child. He says, I'm going to take the child. I'm going to go up. He lays the child out. He doesn't know what God is doing. So he says, God, if you just called me here to kill this woman's son, have you called me here to bring evil upon this woman? That doesn't make sense to me. And so he lays himself over the boy and he prays for the boy. Elijah doesn't know what's going on. Isn't that awesome? I find that to be awesome because I don't know what's going on. I don't know which of my prayers God is going to answer. I don't know when he's going to say yes. I don't know when he's going to say no, but I'll throw myself before him every time and say, God, stuff's going on. I don't get it. And I don't like it, but I trust you. God revives the boy. And then the boy, I don't know if he walks, does it say he walks downstairs? He delivers him to his mother. He takes the child. I doubt he carried him down, because if God does a miracle, he does it right. The child was dead. The child's alive. My guess is the child gets up and walks downstairs hand in hand with Elijah. It does say he carried him. It says he delivered him. He brought the child down and delivered him to his mother. He said, NIV is going to probably, yeah. Any case, I don't want to make too much of a big deal out of it. But the mom sees the boy breathing and alive. How blown away. And now she knows there's one God and who that God is and who's his local representative. It's pretty cool. And yeah, and she'll be telling people. All right. So that was a bonus question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not, yeah. God, thank you, Sandy. Yeah, that, we're talking about God. We're talking about us hearing God's voice, but this passage reminds us that God hears ours. He hears our prayers. And naturally, none of this was a shock to God, right? God knew all of this was going to happen. And ultimately, I tend to think that's why God sent Elijah, because this woman would change. So let's bump over to 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 18. So I'll give you a little background. 1 Kings 18 came just before 1 Kings 19, and I know that that's an awful shock for those of you who can count. But I didn't want to go over this passage all over again, because we did this last year when we talked about spiritual warfare, and I made a great big deal of this passage because I love this. I love chapter 18. Chapter 18 is not only a fantastic passage about the power of God and about the faith of Elijah in the middle of confrontation, but also it's absolutely hilarious because you have this whole situation where God through Elijah is going to have a face down or face off with the priests and the prophets of Baal and Asherah and all these people. And the deal is, all right, we're going to get up there, we're going to fight, and one thing's going to happen. It's either we're going to make two sacrifices, and the God that answers by fire from heaven, that's the God of Israel. And so a crowd gathers to watch this whole thing happen, and Ahab is there and the whole deal. And The priests and the prophets of Baal, they build an altar, they put the sacrifice on it, they dance around all day. They start getting so frustrated that Baal's not answering that they start to cut themselves with their spears and all this, trying to get Baal's attention. And the whole while, Elijah is just making fun of him. Maybe Baal's busy, he says. Go read it. Maybe Baal's in the bathroom, he says to him. Maybe he's sleeping. He's just busting on them the whole time, almost encouraging them to act more ridiculous. And all the while, the text just keeps saying, but no one heard, but no one answered. It's very, very funny. And then they finally end their ranting because they're too exhausted. And Elijah calls for the whole altar to be dismantled, for all the wood to be scattered, for the sacrifice to be taken away. And he builds a fresh altar out of fresh stone, puts fresh wood on it, puts a fresh sacrifice because he doesn't want there to be any confusion about who answers. Then he has the people dig a trench around the altar, and he has them take their canteens because there hasn't been any rain. So they're all carrying canteens and dump their water on the sacrifice and basically says, okay, God, your turn. And God sends down fire from heaven that consumes the sacrifice, consumes the wood, consumes the stone, and licks up all the water that was in the trench. And then the people get all excited and they kill all the priests and the prophets of Baal right there. And then they disperse. And then it's just Elijah and Ahab on top of the mountain. And Elijah looks and he says, hey, do you see something? And it's a cloud. And the cloud's coming closer and it's getting bigger. And Elijah knows it's going to rain. And so it says that he hikes up his robe and he runs down the side of the mountain. And he's running so fast that he outruns Ahab's chariot. He's just defeated the priests and the prophets of Baal. He's shown God to be absolutely superior. He's made Ahab and Jezebel look like morons. And he's also shown that he's one heck of a long distance runner, right? And then we come into chapter 19. And it says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and more so also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. Now, what's hilarious about that first paragraph is we know, if you have been reading in 1 Kings and reading the history stuff, Jezebel personally paid for all of the food for the priests and prophets of Baal. She had them at her table quite frequently, right? They were her number one people. Then she says, I'm going to send people to get you killed. And the joke is, who you going to send? All your people are dead. It's an empty threat. But it freaks Elijah out so much that he runs to Judah. Isn't that great? Don't you see that as great? I see it as great. Because here's Elijah. He's just called fire down from heaven at God's will. He's been fed by ravens. He's been sent by God to go to a town where a widow takes care of him and has everlasting food. He raises a child from the dead. He's absolutely defeated the priests and the prophets of Baal. He's seen rain come upon the land, and he gets an empty threat from an angry woman, and he gets terrified. It sounds like exactly the same stupid kind of thing that I would do. I've absolutely seen God work in my life. I've seen all the wonderful things he's done, and I get a splinter in my hand, and all of a sudden I think I'm going to die. That's not quite me exactly, but it's the same. It's ridiculous that this happens to us so easily. We see God do awesome things, and then we get one little blip, and all of a sudden we're discouraged, just like Elijah. And he's one of the greatest people in the Bible. Like when the Bible talks about people of faith, faithfulness, Elijah's one of them. Not so different from me. Phew. Right? Phew. Let's keep on going here. But he himself, so he leaves his servant in Beersheba. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree because he wanted to get some sleep. Yeah, that just came to me. Comedy genius. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. So I want to remind you, Horeb is another name for Sinai. So he goes to Sinai, Mount Sinai, where God brought the 10 Commandments. There the Lord, there he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him there, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and have killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when he heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord and the God of hosts. The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have yet not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." We'll just stop there. So that's a good lead in. We'll read that passage again next week. Alrighty? We'll read that passage again in 3 weeks when we have Sunday school again. Let me close this with a word of prayer. Father, thank you very much for today. Thank you for your love for us and for your graciousness. May we hear your voice and follow it. In Jesus' name, amen.